This sweater has been about 2 years in the making now. Not because it's especially difficult or really even that time consuming, but mostly because I don't know what I'm doing. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you probably know that I spend a lot of time scouring the internet for old-timey crochet patterns. When I came across this sweater pattern a couple years ago, I knew immediately that I had to make it. Aside from looking nice and comfy, this sweater also seemed like the perfect history bounding sweater because I could totally see myself wearing this with a pair of jeans, and if I were to wear it out in public, I don't think anyone would think that I was wearing a costume. At first glance, the pattern seemed easy enough, so I thought this was going to be a fairly quick project. No. The more historical crochet patterns I look at, the more I realize how coddled we are by modern crochet instructions, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Some of the oldest patterns I've come across are from the mid-Victorian era, and they tend to make a lot of assumptions about the reader's existing knowledge of crochet. Sometimes the instructions are fairly vague, at least to my modern mind. They also tend to leave a lot to the judgment of the maker, and that's if they have written instructions at all. A lot of times you'll just come across an illustration of a finished item, and it's like, this is what you're making. All right, well, go on, figure it out. Contrast that to patterns that were written today, which tend to be super, super detailed. Here's your gauge and your hook size and your yarn size and step-by-step instructions for every single row, along with photos of what it should look like at each stage in the process. And if that's not enough, you can watch my video tutorial over on YouTube. It's been really fascinating to see the slow progression of how patterns were written and standardized over time. Personally, I found that the older a pattern is, the more likely I will need to translate it into something that I can actually follow along with while I'm crocheting. This sweater pattern was published in 1917, so it was kind of in the middle. The instructions were fairly detailed, but I still ended up translating it into a more modern format because this wall of text would have made it impossible for me to keep track of where I was at in the process. This had the added benefit of allowing me to think through the project before I started stitching, which was a good thing because I quickly ran into. I've made several crochet sweaters before, and I found that the construction of them usually falls into one of three categories. One, crocheting in the round, where you start at the neckline and wind your way down the rest of the body, then attach some tube sleeves in a similar manner. Number two, the flat pattern, where you make 4 separate pieces and seam them at the sides, shoulders, and underarms, very much like a sewing pattern. And 3, the over-the-shoulder drape, where you make the bodice in one large flat shape, fold it in half and seam up the sides, and then you can attach the sleeves either as flat pieces or crocheted in the round. I assumed this sweater would work similarly, so as I was translating the pattern, I was keeping these methods in mind and trying to figure out which construction method they were using for this project. A few lines in, and I was pretty sure I had figured it out, but then I came across a section that seemed not right. After a few hours of staring at my screen in frustration, I ended up just drawing a chart line by line to try and picture what this shape was, and I finally figured out the construction method. The answer was none of the above. This is a flat pattern, but it works in vertical rows that wrap around the body with a seam up the center front and at the shoulders, and then you have flat sleeves attached as usual. Fun fact about vintage and historical crochet patterns, standardized hook and yarn sizes were not always a thing. If old patterns mention specific materials at all, more often than not, those materials are no longer in production. And since the standard yarn weight system that we use today is a fairly recent invention, it can be tricky to find appropriate substitutes for older patterns. Thankfully, this pattern had a photo, and the very distinct grid-like stitch pattern allowed me to see the size of the stitches relative to the size of a person, which was a helpful clue when exploring possible yarn options. I tried some test swatches with both light and medium weight yarns that I had in my stash and could immediately tell that those were going to be too bulky for this project. I ended up purchasing this fingering weight wool for the main part of the sweater as I liked the color, the size, and it wasn't going to break the bank. For the cuffs and collar, the pattern says to use white yarn and then brush it into a thick nap to get that soft and fluffy look. That sounded scary, so I got some pre-fluffed acrylic instead. Feeling very confident in my choices, I finally began stitching. I started this sweater about a year before I started my YouTube channel, so a lot of the initial work was done off camera. I originally used a 3.5mm hook for this project and got quite a bit done before I realized it wasn't going to fit. I have 46-inch hips and no amount of stretching or blocking was going to make that work. So I started over with a 5mm hook instead, hoping the looser stitching would give me the ease I needed. Alright, so we are getting near the end of the bodice. I have about 40 rows left, and I'm getting a little bit nervous that this still is not going to be big enough, even with the bigger hook size. So I'm a pear-shaped human, and that's something I commonly struggle with, is finding tops that actually fit me all over. If I find stuff that is longer, that goes around the hips, I need to fit around the hips, which means my bust and shoulder area is usually too big. And then if I go the opposite direction and find something that actually fits my bust and shoulders, it's usually riding up on me because it is not wide enough to go around my hips. So that's always fun. So I'm getting a little bit nervous because this section down here at the end, we're finishing up with single crochets, which means the bottom portion of the sweater is much tighter than the rest of it. It doesn't have as much stretch. I'm hoping that blocking is going to fix that. Maybe. This is wool, so hopefully it should block well. If it doesn't, I might be getting different yarn because I'm not super pleased with how this yarn has been working out with the bigger hook. It's very splitty. It's really kind of frustrating to work with, and this whole time I've been having, it's been a bit of a struggle to get a good flow going with my stitches. The hook keeps getting in between the yarn, and it hasn't been a fun experience. And I feel since I switched to the bigger hook, my tension is all over the place, and it just doesn't look as clean as when I had, so this is my original one that I was using the smaller hook with. See these very clear, I can definitely see why they called it a block stitch. I feel like my tension was much better with the smaller hook. I'm less pleased with this one. So we're so close to the end. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to try and finish the bodice. I'll see if it fits. I'll see if blocking fixes some of my tension sins. If it doesn't, then we're gonna have to come up with a new plan and probably new yarn, because I don't think going up another hook size is gonna fix it. I mean it might fit, but I think I'm gonna just make this texture issue even worse. So let's find out. After much debate and frustration, I have decided the yarn that I chose for this pattern is just not going to work for this project. Even if it is large enough to fit around my hips with the current hook size that I'm using, I'm afraid it's still not going to be loose enough to really get the style that I want. So if you look at the photo that comes with the original pattern, it looks kind of loose, and I'm afraid that even if this does technically fit, it's not going to be like that. I think it's going to catch on my hips and ride up and just not look great. And to be honest, since I switched to a bigger hook size, my tension has been all over the place. It's just been really frustrating to work with. I think this yarn, while I love the color, I love that it's wool, it's just not right for this project. I did what I told myself I was not going to do, and I bought more yarn. So the palette, the pink yarn that I started with, I believe was a fingering weight, and I think this one was a sport weight, so it's slightly thicker, which I'm hoping will help with the sizing issues. Another issue that I was having with the pink yarn is that it's very textured on its own, and the texture of the stitch was getting lost, especially since I switched to a bigger hook size. This yarn is a little bit smoother, it doesn't have much texture of its own, and I'm hoping that will give it more stitch definition so that the pattern itself can really shine. I've made this twice now. I've made this harness twice now. I got through about 90% this time, and I'm starting from scratch again because this just isn't working. I will definitely use this yarn for something else, something that, you know, maybe doesn't have such a complicated stitch, so that something that doesn't need as much stitch definition. But it's just not right for this project. I know if it's too small or if I'm not happy with the way it looks, I'm not going to wear it, and I want to make something that I am going to wear and I'm going to use. So we're starting over. So I did my test swatch, and I think it's still going to be too small with the H hook. This is 8 rows, and it comes out to about 2 inches. My hips are about 46 around. The pattern has about 172 of the block stitch rows, and then there's an additional 5 single chain rows on either side, so an additional 10 rows. We're just going to focus on the block stitch rows because I definitely want to have some ease in this pattern. So if we take 172 divided by 8, that's 21.5 times 2 inches, that's only 43. This is also not going to fit with the H hook. We're going to try going up a hook size and see if that helps. I will say that so far the stitching experience is far superior with this yarn. It is so much easier, and my tension looks better, and it is getting that nice block stitch pattern. So A+ on that. Does not split, love that. We're going to try a bigger hook and see if that fixes the sizing issue. Alright, here's swatch number 2 with an I hook. 8 rows here equal about 2 1/4. So let's do the math. Moment of truth here. So we have 172 times, oopsie, 2.25, 48. Yes, we got it. I hook it is. Having thoroughly learned my lesson about the importance of making a gauge swatch before I invest tons of time in a project, I was, at last, on track to finish this sweater. As much as it pained me to start over for a third time, it quickly became clear that I had made the right call. Turns out, this pattern works up pretty fast when you're not fighting your materials every step of the way. Crochet has spurned these pillows for a cold metal cart. I'm usually a weave the ends in as you go kind of person, but I held off because I had already frogged this project so many times, I was afraid of the commitment. Now, of course, I have regrets. Alright, after about 2 hours of weaving in ends, we are finally ready to move on to the next step. So I was debating whether I actually needed to block these pieces because this yarn has some fabulous drape. Look at that. I'm very excited about that. However, some of the edges where I was using like single crochets or slip stitches to finish up the edges, they are a little bit tighter than the rest of the piece, so I think I am going to block at least the edges to hopefully stretch out. You see, it's a little crinkly there. Help stretch out these things and hopefully make them lay a little bit flatter. This yarn is, I think it said 60% bamboo viscose and 40% cotton, which I have never worked with before, so I'm not 100% sure what blocking method would work the best. I have done cotton before, and that works really well with just plain old wet blocking, so I think that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to wet it, stretch it, pin it, and let it dry and see if that works and makes things nice and flat for stitching. So let's go. I was hoping to be able to do all of this in one go, but I don't have enough blocking mats to put the bodice and the sleeves out at the same time. They just won't fit. So I will do the bodice first, let that dry for a day or two, and then I will do the sleeves after that. It'll take a little longer than I expected. Oh well. Status update on the blocking. The wet blocking worked very well with this bamboo and cotton mix. Took the pins out, and it's still keeping a nice crisp edge. So very pleased about that. Now onto the sleeves. For the cuffs and collar, the pattern doesn't actually tell you which stitch to use. It just tells you to crochet to a certain dimension. It says 11 by 14. I just kind of winged it. This is my first attempt at the collar, and this was just regular rows of half double crochets, and I wasn't a huge fan of this. I just didn't really like that look, so I made a second one that I'm much happier with. This one was done with alternating single crochet and double crochet. So every other stitch is single crochet, double crochet, single crochet, double crochet. And I like this effect much better. The rows are less obvious. I think it enhances the soft and fluffy look that I'm going for. This is what I'm gonna do. This is the collar piece that's done. And then I still have to make the cuffs and kind of the hem at the bottom of the sweater. But I'm gonna do it in this stitch. All right, the bodice is mostly done. We are getting very close to the end. I am mostly happy with it. It does look like it's supposed to for the most part. You can definitely tell this is a late teens getting into the 1920s. Got this very straight, no curve silhouette here, which is exactly what the reference photo has, so good there. I'm thinking it is maybe a bit too long. This is down to like my mid thigh, and the reference photo doesn't look quite that long, so I think what I might do is hem it, because this is a secret. When I was stitching it up the center seam, I realized that this side was a bit longer than this side, so I've already done some hemming anyway to even those out. Don't tell anybody. I think I'm gonna hem it even more and even it out to make it shorter, and it will also help because it's got that band of white along the edge there, which will cover up any weird stitches or anything. So I don't think it's going to be that noticeable if I fold this up to make it a bit shorter. The back is interesting. I don't hate it. I'm going to leave it as it is, one, because it doesn't really bother me. It's just strange. This back piece almost reminds me more of some fashions that I've seen from like the 18th and early 19th century, where it's that kind of weird, like almost like diamond shape for the back that kind of forces your shoulders back, because you'll notice this seam is pretty far back on the shoulders, and I think if this were a tighter woven fabric, it would kind of like pull your shoulders back like that, but because it's so long and loose, it really doesn't bother me. It's fine. But if I were to make this again, I think I would make the back probably 2 rows wider on either side and make the front portion a little bit shorter, so it's kind of a more modern fit around the shoulders. But other than that, It's coming together really good. It looks how I want it to for the most part. Next is going to be putting the sleeves on, and I wanted to try this on to see how long I should make the sleeves. They do tell you to make the sleeve cuffs 5 inches, but I want to make sure this is actually going to fit me. So I need to see how long from the top of the sleeve to my wrist it is to figure out how big I want to make my cuffs. It is finally finished. Finally. I am very pleased with how this came out. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. There are some spots where, like, don't look too closely. One of my sleeve cuffs is slightly wider than the other, but it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough, and I think we are definitely there. I'm not ashamed to wear this out in public. In fact, I think I will be wearing it quite a bit because it's super cozy and comfy, and I love it. I'm actually glad that I ended up going with the bamboo cotton viscose yarn instead of wool, because I think the wool might have been actually too warm. Because this is a very big, loose sweater. You got this big gap here, which is part of the original pattern. If you look at the example photos they have, this also is here. It is a sweater that is really intended to be worn over things, and I worry if I had picked like acrylic or wool or something like that, that it would have been a little bit too warm. So actually my accidental material shift probably worked out for the best in the end. Overall, this was a really fun project. I like this stitch a lot, and it's something that I might be using in other projects because I love the texture. It's not too difficult. I think it looks a little bit more interesting than some of like your standard crochet stitches. I'm so glad that it's done. It was worth the wait. I am pleased with it. If you enjoy projects like this, I do have more plans for vintage and historical crochet projects, as well as more history bounding, sewing, and bookish content. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, maybe give this video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.